A good nerve Shabbos. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest, was the very moving closing phrase of now King Charles's first address after his mother's passing. The full quote from Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 1, is, "Now cracks a noble heart. Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." Shakespeare was at least as good a researcher as an inventor of prose. If you take a look in our Siddur for Friday night, right between Shalom Aleichem and Eshes Chayil, at the Shabbos table, there are two lines that I think probably inspired Shakespeare. They're on the top of page 356 in our Siddur. One line is from Psalm 91, another is from Psalm 121. They say, Ki malachev yitzavelach lishmorcha b'chol derachecha. He will charge his angels for you to protect you in all your ways. And Hashem yishmor tzeischa uvayecha me'ata v'yad olam. May God protect your going and coming now and forevermore. That's a good entree to talk about angels, because we have some in our parsha this week. Specifically, the angels, the keruvim, cherubim, on top of the ark that contains the tablets of the Ten Commandments. We're going to talk for a few weeks now about building the Mishkan, constructing a portable tabernacle, a sanctuary that we took with us as we went through the desert for 40 years and then into Israel, once we went into the land of Israel. And this tabernacle, this Mishkan, was the center of Jewish worship for hundreds of years until the temple in Jerusalem was built. The lessons from this are some of the most basic and eternal attitudes of our people, and they have sustained us not only on that journey, but on our present journey as well. One lesson is that you can take it with you. When we go into exile, when we go on the road, either forced out of the land of Israel or other lands, wherever we happen to be going for whatever reason, we do not leave our faith, our community, and our divine service behind us. We can take with us the means to connect to God and form community and be true to our Jewish selves no matter where we go. Another lesson is that Judaism requires of us things that we already have. The materials are all around us. We just have to gather them together, arrange them in the right order, and use them for a good purpose. Living a Jewish life is not only for saints, not only for people somewhere else, not only for others gifted with resources that most of us don't have. The opposite is true. Being Jewish and living our best Jewish life is the province and birthright of every Jew, no matter where we live or when. It's the rightful and proper inheritance of each of us for all times. The key phrase in understanding these ideas comes from the Midrash Tanchuma's comment on a verse in the opening of our portion this week, Parshas Terumah. The Torah says, in the course of instructing us how to build the Mishkan, it says, V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socham. Build me a sanctuary, says God, and I will dwell in them. The Midrash notes the apparent inconsistency of the singular and the plural and clarifies, if the Jewish people build me, this is God speaking, a sanctuary, I will dwell in them, in each and every Jew. So that takes place on the communal level as well as the individual. So in these couple of weeks, we're going to learn about the Mishkan, this tabernacle, portable sanctuary. Its frame was of wood, it had connecting parts and a base that leveled it on the floor made of precious metals. Its covering was made of wool, and the floor itself was the desert sands, and the Kohanim, the priests, served inside it. In other words, it had had components from all elements of creation in its construction. We're going to learn about the implements, or the vessels, the kelim, used in the daily functioning of the Mishkan, later the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, an altar of gold for incense, another altar for offerings, a golden menorah, similar to the ones that we use for Hanukkah in our days, a table for showbreads, which fed the Kohanim. We'll also learn about the clothing, the priestly garments worn by the Kohanim, both the set of 4 garments worn by a Kohen Hedyot, a regular Kohen serving in the Mishkan, shirt, pants, belt, and hat, and the additional 4 items worn by the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And of course, in the chapters that follow these, meaning the passages in the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, the functions of the Kohanim, and various offerings that accompany the annual cycle of holidays, as well as individual needs like thanksgiving and atonement. All these elements continue in our prayers and our studies to this day, in some form or another. So there's one element of the Mishkan in particular that continues to fascinate, and that is, of course, the Ark, the Aron HaKodesh, the Ark which carried the tablets in it. These precious items with the 10 Commandments engraved on them. You can't just throw those in the trunk or the glove compartment or keep them in the garage. You have to treat them with awe and respect and reverence that's their due. So the Ark is described here in detail, made of wood, coated with gold inside and gold outside, with its handles permanently attached to its sides, so it would be ready for us to take with whenever we needed to get on the road. Now on top of the Ark, what's there? A cover. With what? Of all things, angels. Interesting. First we have to figure out why and what they're doing there and what they mean, and to get to that point we're going to have to resolve a couple of problems that come up in our minds. First of all, if you look at those 10 commandments, you'll find among them a prohibition of graven images. Remember that one? You shall not make for thyself any graven image. Thou shalt not make for thyself, thyself, any graven image. In other words, a three-dimensional representation. Well, what are statues of angels but three-dimensional representations? You want to challenge that notion and say, well, they shouldn't really count because they're not representations of God. Okay, point well taken. Furthermore, you want to say, look, God told us to make them. Doesn't a positive commandment of Vasisa Shnayim Kruvim Zahav, you shall make two cherubim, two keruvim, two angels of gold on the cover of the ark, doesn't that override the prohibition? It's also a good point. In fact, we do. The Abarbanel grapples with this question and notices that since there certainly was no intent to worship these images, they don't go against the prohibition of graven images. Fine. Midrash Leket Tov, also called Psikta Zutrasi, lists a number of things that the Torah prohibits in one place and then permits in another. Shatnez is prohibited. We're not supposed to wear garments made of linen and wool. Get our suits checked to make sure there's no linen and wool in them. Then the Big Day Kahuna, the priestly garments we spoke about, have this in the belt. The mitzvah of Yibum, others. So here also. Meshech Chochmah wants to say that it's this slippery boundary area. Making graven images is not okay until it's okay. That led the Bnei Yisrael to making the horrible mistake, 2 parshas from now, in Kisisa, the sin of the golden calf. See, if making images is permitted in some cases, then someone came up with the idea, we'll make an idol to worship. Moshe Rabbeinu was busy up on the mountain. We didn't have anyone to ask. It became a hot mess very quickly. We'll talk about it when we get there. In 2 weeks' time, Shabbos Zachor. Stay tuned. Rambam, Maimonides, and Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, tries to get us to understand that these practical three-dimensional representations of beings who have no physical form is really an exercise in faith. Malachim, another name for angels, are messengers. That's what the name means. They put the words of God on the lips of the prophets, among other duties in their job description. The words of angels that are probably best known to us, probably those that the angels revealed to Isaiah in chapter 6 of his book, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzivakos, holy, 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 is the Lord of hosts. That's the high point of our Kedusha when we daven as a community. So Rambam says, think about a messenger that has no form, no physicality, is a purely spiritual being that does things and carries out tasks and even says or sings things, and now you're in the realm of being able to conceive of powers that don't have a physical form at all. It's an exercise in faith, see? It's a little curious that to help us in this exercise, we dafka have a three-dimensional form, but there you have it. Rambam also mentions the fact that the fact that there are two make it impossible for anyone to believe or imagine that these are representations of the divine. If there were one cherub on top of the Aron, maybe you could make a mistake. Since there's two, no one would ever dream or could possibly make a mistake that there's anything divine about them, because God is never two or any other number other than one. There's a side note here, maybe it's not such a side note, that one of the angels is male-gendered and the other is female-gendered, which long before it was cool, taught us not to link any gender especially to power or to inspiration. The Gemara in Chagiga mentions that the word ravia means child or infant, so karavia or karuv Cherub, is how we transliterate that into English, is like a child. The latter-day commentaries found an ethical message in the purity of children. Torah Tamima from Lithuania, late 1800s, says that this is to arouse the Rachmanis of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the Jewish people, just as our hearts are stirred by the sight of a child. A different Gemara in Yuma explains that the Keruvim are reminders of God's love for the Jewish people. When we would go out on pilgrimages to Yerushalayim, the Kohanim would show us the Aron with the Keruvim on top, the cherubs on top, and remind us that God's love for us is like the love of a husband and wife. Rabbeinu Bachya seems to think that the figures have an adult face and a child's face, suggesting the love between a parent and a child. That's another dimension. The Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin of Volozhin, whose youngest son Meir went on Aliyah, changed his name to Bar Ilan, you may have heard of it. He puts more depth into the image still. He writes, the Bnei Yisrael's love for HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the love of a recipient of goodness for the one who bestows the goodness. In that kind of relationship, he writes, the eyes of the receiver are constantly turned toward the giver, and the giver's eyes are on the receiver. A Song of Songs says, Ani ledodi v'alai chukosai. I am my beloved's, and his desire is towards me. Chukasoi, that's what it is. There's a curious footnote in this. Still another Gemara in Bava Basra that discusses the Keruvim tells about a sort of miracle that took place. When the Bnei Yisrael were doing what we were supposed to be doing, living the good life, the two Keruvim faced each other, indicating the kind of relationship we're talking about here. In those times in history, when the Jewish people were not getting along, and conflict and strife marked our relationships more than love and concern, times we're living in are not the first, clearly, the Keruvim would face apart, away from each other. Now, when the Romans came and sacked Yerushalayim and profaned the temple, ruined the Beis HaMikdash, they ripped down the parochis, the curtain in front of the ark, and they made fun of us because here in our holy temple we had little statues of a man and a woman, and they were embracing. They saw that at this worst of times, the two Keruvim, symbolizing the relationship between us and God, were embracing each other. How could that be? The destruction of the temple seemed to be the all-time low point in the relationship between the Jews and God. The physical destruction of our most holy place seemed to indicate that our relationship was at its worst, its most estranged. Some say that this embrace was like a goodbye kiss, while others maintain that just like we have 3 weeks of harsh rebuke in the weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av and the Haftorahs of those weeks, the date when this awful destruction and separation took place, and just like that harshness is followed by 7 weeks of comfort, more than a double measure, so also the hardness and pain of whatever rift there was in our relationship with God at the time was accompanied by at least a double measure of closeness and comfort and essential love. That's the symbolism of the embrace of the Keruvim at the time of the Chorban. So angels, maybe the angels that accompany us home on Friday night and wait until we sing Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharis, greetings to you, ministering angels, come in, bless us, and then Tzeichem L'Shalom, off you go, ministering angels, because who can eat your meal with a bunch of angels standing around? And the Malachim, the angels that accompany us all the time, wherever we go, hopefully the better angels of our nature, they have a lot of work, from providing prophets with their script, by extension the wording of our prayers. They all have a lot of messages to impart to us. It's certainly about the sweet singing. It's also about healing and protecting and finding and connecting and imagining. In Ezra and Daniel, angels are even teachers. We're not them and they're not us, but there's a lot to learn, because as they are dedicated and faithful to their mission, so should we be to ours. A good Shabbos.